The chandelier was a constellation falling toward them, crystal teeth catching the light and throwing it across linen and lipstick and the small, immaculate faces of the crowd. Serena stood at the head of the long table, ring warm against her palm, a wineglass trembling as if it knew what was coming before she did. Her dress fit like a promise. Her smile had been practiced down to the cadence of breath. Cameras hovered like moths. Cameras always did. She had written the speech in the small hours the night before, words folded into a neat stack on her phone. 7 years of ordinary mercies, the dream of a life that would make sense in the calendar of her family. She had planned the evening as one might plan a miracle, quietly, with fastidious detail. Auntie Chen had come with her pearls and a warning in a low voice about the old family jinx, the kind of things Serena laughed at, then tucked into the pocket of superstition like a talisman. "You are not a story to be cursed," Auntie Chen had said. "You are a book you write." Serena had liked that instead of anything louder. Then the phone buzzed against Asher's tux pocket. It could have been any number of things: business, a board emergency, one of his father's old dramas. Asher had always moved as if he could make the world tilt to his will. He had the kind of voice that convinced the glassware to lean toward him. When he took the call, he turned away from the table with one of those smiles that had once been the weather in her life. "Not now," she said without thinking, because it seemed ordained that on this night there would be no other occupier of the space between them. He did not answer. He did not look over his shoulder. He stepped into the press of his entourage as if the party's air had a door only he could open. He stayed out of sight longer than a courtesy would allow. The music thinned into the background. The guests' conversations folded under the sudden, insected hush of attention. Serena could feel the room measuring the distance between a woman in a wedding dress and the man who had promised marriage. When he returned, he was not alone. Luna moved with a fragile, practiced grace, the kind that read to strangers like the truth. She carried a faint smile that said she understood her placement in stories, a role she had been assigned and learned to inhabit. They had been an old thing, Asher and Luna. More than one person in the room had remembered the way they glowed around each other before anyone else had a vote. Gossip has a memory long enough to stitch up old wounds. Asher's smile fell on Luna like a lid. He reached for her hand in a way that made something in Serena sink like a stone. He lifted it to his lips, a small, private ceremony performed in public. Conversation resumed, clipped and perfunctory, as if the world had accepted an amendment. Her mouth was dry. The ring in her hand felt heavier. She walked toward him with a steadiness that hid the quake on the edges.
People parted because people always did when someone crossed the center of their night. Asher's eyes, when they found her, were quick and bright and entirely sly. "Is something wrong?" he asked, as if he had not spent the last minutes rebelling against the sound of her voice. She said what she had rehearsed and what she hadn't. "If you take that call, I will never forgive you." It was a line that carried years of small omissions, of birthdays missed, of consolations withheld. It hung then like a mirror between them. For a moment that lasted like a reckoning, she could see the contour of his choice. Asher's thumb rubbed the phone's edge, and he looked at her as if she were a chapter he'd read and decided to skip. He answered the call. That was the moment the room began to tilt. He turned toward Luna, toward the laughter that had been waiting for him, toward something that had always been allowed to keep him from being whole. He did not come back. People talked after that the way crowds do when they need to shuttle the uncomfortable away. Euphemism, disbelief, the polite inspections of what had been left on the table. Someone moved the ring across the white linen and set it down like an unfortunate coin. Someone else began to clap, because clapping is the social equivalent of a life jacket. Serena felt smaller than the ring, like a fold of the dress. She left before anyone could make it a performance. She walked out into the damp night and the cool hug of a city that didn't know her. The valet held her door like a man committed to civility until the last possible second. She drove herself. She let the pressure of the steering wheel under her fingers remind her of the world's solid parts. The photos hit the feeds before she reached her building. The headline spelled out humiliation in capital letters. Left at the altar, fiancé leaves bride for ex. Her inbox became a river of grief and hot small weapons. What happened? Did you see? People sent a dozen different condolence emojis that evening, as if grief could be made visual through tiny cartoon hands. Asher sent a text, brief, careful, a model of damage control. He wrote, "I am sorry for tonight. Let's talk when you're ready." The message was a bandage shaped like absence. Serena blocked his number and then unblocked it twice, a tick of someone who still had a memory of what had happened before the call, before the choices. She did not call him back. Inside the apartment, Auntie Chen waited like someone whose name had more than one key. She had watched enough weddings to know the choreography of grief. He chose the old thing, she said once Serena told the story, and there was a quiet that said this was not only her private loss. That night, Serena learned the language of gossip as if it were a second dialect. Friends called, some with grief, others with the clinical curiosity of those who live by spectacle.
Her mother wept on the other end of a line that could not close the distance between two people suddenly unmoored. By morning, the story had legs. Asher's justification followed the pattern of denial that privilege lends itself to. There was a business emergency, a momentary lapse, a conversation that was misconstrued. Reporters' questions were answered with rehearsed faintness. He had been overwhelmed. He had needed a moment. He had been caught between histories. Luna posted an image of the two of them at a museum months ago, and the caption was as neutral as a ledger. Old friends. The internet knows how to wedge meaning between neutral phrases. But this was not the first time. Serena drilled down through memory like someone tracing a hairline crack. There were birthdays that had been solo, holidays that had been sidelines, nights that had been excuses. He had apologized before, small private amends offered in the quiet, and then folded away like origami promises. The pattern made it worse. It meant his choice was not a thoughtless misstep, but the culmination of an architecture built to allow him to leave. She did not beg. She had the pride of someone who had made herself on the far side of him. She had learned to be fierce in small things, and to guard what was left of herself. But she also opened a file on her phone and typed out evidence. Snippets of messages, photos of empty chairs, calendar entries where he had signed his name across hers. The pile of small truths felt like ballast. The earliest days after the night were a geography of the same small battles, friends deciding which side felt morally safer, editors at the lifestyle magazine deciding whether to run a think piece about the dangers of aligning one's identity with another's. Luna cultivated the softness of a woman wronged by rumors, the kind that makes the rumor look cruel. Grace, a mutual contact, started a subtle campaign to suggest Serena had been unstable in the weeks leading up to the engagement, citing, with the smarm of someone at court, that Serena had been seen at a late-night party. The internet loves an angle. Someone found a photo of Serena laughing at a rooftop bar, and a headline suggested a comparison, party girl versus betrayed fiancé, instead of noting the two truths might happily exist together. Then the accusation arrived like a thunderclap. There had been a rehearsal dinner 2 nights before, an intimate circle of family and a handful of close friends. A toast turned awkward when Mr. Lin, Asher's father, rose. The room leaned in because men like Mr. Lin carry a silence that needs to be noticed. A waitress later vomited into a sink. Someone made an embarrassed joke. A guest left early. At midnight, a page went up on social media with a blurry photograph. Serena's hand near a glass, the other hand on the wrist of the woman who had passed out. A caption alleged Serena had slipped something into the drink.
The photograph came without context, only the certainty of accusation. It found its way into feeds and into the minds of people who already liked a tidy narrative. Serena read the post one morning with coffee cold at her throat. She stared at the image until it began to float. Nothing in it proved anything. Still, the seed lodged. Rumor has its own law. A photograph, anonymous, is more persuasive than a denial. A woman she had known since college called and said, with the tentative sympathy of someone who avoids people in storms, "They're saying you drugged someone." She wanted to throw the phone. Instead, she called Drew, who had been her physician for years, a man whose bedside manner was more a compass than a balm. "You need to go to the hospital," he instructed, in the voice of someone who did not enjoy talking about what he could fix. "Get tests. Don't let them make the story of you while you sit still." At the hospital, fluorescent lights felt like interrogation lamps. Nurses moved with the economy of people who see panic in shapes they can treat. The woman who had been pictured, one of Asher's cousins, was under observation. She had indeed lost consciousness for a span long enough to frighten people, but the toxicology screen came back inconclusive in the narrow window they could test. Still, the rumor machine had been fed. A lab report that said nothing and a photograph that suggested everything were oddly harmonious. Serena left before the pageant of questions could begin in full. The cameras loved the moments of moral fog. She didn't owe them anything, but people watched her leaving like a last chapter and took the sight as confirmation. Someone leaked a private message to a gossip account, one where Serena had argued with a friend about the cost of public life. The comment was cropped and presented as a confession. It is possible to be ruined by the same people who once loved you. Social collapse often feels like watching a city burn while still living in the building.
Serena took a deep breath and cataloged the losses instead of the grief. A sponsor pulled a foundation offer. A magazine editor called to say a spread would be postponed indefinitely. A friend suggested she lay low for the public good. She found strength in the small radical act of speaking truth aloud to the people around her, of demanding to be recognized in full complexity. Then the other things began to happen. Threatening notes slid under her door. A ruined photograph turned up on a blog with a timeline that didn't match. It seemed as if someone had set a machine into motion, old cogs grinding out stories meant to make her look small. Serena stopped assuming coincidences. Patterns are the work of minds, not luck. Ethan entered the edges of her life like a shadow with a purpose. He was not the sort of man who lived in the main rooms. He worked in the margins, security contracts, debt collecting for people who paid him for the doing of unpleasant things.
Eyes like weather, a voice that left no room for argument, a man with no moral punctuation. He had been seen with Luna's new partner at a charity auction. He had the lean build of someone who could carry a body without looking like he'd broken a sweat. One evening, Serena found a note in her mailbox. No signature, just 3 numbers and a time. She recognized the handwriting style from the past. It was the sort of thing that said, "We know how to get to you." She told herself it was nothing, and then told Auntie Chen, because you tell old women things they can help you fold into fortitude. A week later, the city moved against her in a new way. A man from a fund that had once been on the table when they planned their wedding called with quiet urgency to say that an unmarked envelope had been delivered to the firm with photographs and a veiled threat. The evidence smelled of a setup. Someone had arranged a fall that would look like a spiral and designed her as the center. Fear makes neat decisions simple. Serena changed her locks. She deleted her social media. She hired a lawyer for the first time to answer questions she had sworn she'd never have to answer. None of those actions erased the acidic memory of being the subject of a story that made no room for nuance. The abduction shouldn't have happened. It was the sort of folly that happens to the earnest and the unlucky. Serena had spent the afternoon going from one small appointment to another, a meeting with a PR advisor who'd been kind enough to tell her what to say, a quick coffee alone to try and remember how to be a person aside from narrative. She had been patient at a crosswalk when the city pushed impatiently. She had stepped off the curb, and the next thing she knew was a weight at her side. 2 men, straps across her shoulders, a blindfold of cheap fabric, and the smell of diesel and the rust of a van that seemed to have been waiting for her. They did not steal her for ransom in the romantic sense. They stole her to make a point. They wanted leverage, a bargaining chip, someone to place in the center of a board of negotiations she had not known existed. Ethan was not gentle in this. He was efficient. He made no threats that evening, because for him, the mere act of taking her was the point. The mutational thing about menace is how quickly it replaces argument. She was placed in a room with cool concrete and a single window that slatted like bars. Time compressed. She thought with a focused calm that was almost clinical, of places to run, of the story of her life before the wedding, of the library she used to go to where the librarian remembered her name. She banged on the door until her hands ached. She screamed until her throat found an economy of noise. For the first time since the party, she felt the animal clarity of a threat so immediate that everything else, gossip, humiliation, conjecture, seemed small. They came for a compact, though they never called it by that name.
They wanted Asher to do something he could not do publicly, to deliver a note, to confess to a sliver of complicity he may or may not have had. They wanted a scandal to be more scandalous. Their bargaining was a cheap theater. She tried reason first with Ethan, because it is always worth testing the water. "You won't win," she said. "You're only building a story, and they'll turn against you." He smiled at her like someone blessed by void. "People always pick a side," he said. "What I do makes people choose faster." They kept her for 2 nights. During it, she did what she had learned to do in small crises: catalogued, observed, and preserved information. She watched the men shift in their sleep like thieves at a table. She listened to the street below for any pattern. She thought of Drew and the way a doctor regards a wound, impersonal, searching for variables. She thought, too, of Hudson. Hudson was a name that had carried through her adulthood like a constant discounting noise, steady, patient, reliable. He had been in and out of her orbit for years as a friend of the firm, a man with a quiet smile and a company that clocked the world in contracts and commodities. He was not the kind of man to make a spectacle. He had sent a text the night of the engagement catastrophe that said simply, "I'm here if you need anything." When she had brushed past him at a charity gala weeks later, he had offered her nothing more scandalous than a cup of coffee in a moment that had been less theatrically charged than the rest of her life. He had the sort of hands that might carry a hospital tray without breaking his composure. He had the sort of presence that could make a room breathe differently. He was the one who found her. They told her later that it had been a neighbor who had noticed a van, an old argument about suspicious vehicles, who had caught the police. They told her later that a surveillance camera at a shuttered workshop had captured faces. They told her that Hudson had come with a team and had waited for law to do its thing, but that he had not moved away. He had stood at the edge of the scene like the steady presence that he was. He had not spoken until the police read her the brief lines that unspooled the legal reality of her theft. He asked one question when it was over. "Are you hurt?" His voice had no need for scripts. She had wanted to say no, just as everyone does after something monstrous. But she realized, later in the shelter of a hospital bed, that her wrist had been bruised and catalogued by an anxious intern. Her throat had the rasp of someone who had been forced to yell and then held quiet. A smear of silt like engine oil clung to her shoe. Her phone had been smashed. Hudson did not make a show of rescuing her. He signed documents with a lawyer's efficiency and asked for nothing in return. He arranged for Drew to see her, made sure a police report was taken, and offered Serena a place to rest that was not a room in the hospital.
He drove her home because she could not bear to be driven by anyone else yet. The drive was ordinary, the city at night with its tired lights, and the quiet was unusual. Conversation between them landed as if it had been handed a script written for two people who had survived something and had to decide afterward whether to become known to each other anew. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," Hudson said, the kind of pause that could be read as both civility and an invitation. He set a hand on her shoulder for a second, no more, no less, a benediction from someone who understood boundaries. That night she slept at his place because sleep at her own apartment felt like returning to a stage. She dressed in borrowed sweatshirts and let the world reduce itself to a sequence of small acts. Eat, breathe, receive the kindness of people whose kindness came without cameras. In the days that followed, the case made its way into the half-legend of the city. The police compiled reports. Ethan's men were named, after which their faces belonged to papers and a judge. Luna's name appeared in a side-by-side comparison of motives, as did Asher's. The picture that had once seemed so clean, the narrative where Serena was the cause, began to crumble in parts. The photograph was now one item on a stack, not a verdict. Still, rumor gnawed. Someone in Asher's circle leaked that she had been the architect of her own drama, that she had staged the abduction for attention. It was the sort of nonsense that smells like desperation, an attempt to make sense of random cruelty by giving it pattern. The internet is a fast machine for stitching together improbable narratives. Serena thought. She gave statements. She refused to be told the story about herself. She hired a team of lawyers who treated rumor like an affliction that could be prosecuted. She worked with Drew to document the injuries and the trauma, and named therapists who could help with the tremor in her hands that did not fade with the passing of time. And she kept the ring. Auntie Chen argued she should sell it. "It is like a hot coal," she said. "You can carry it, but it will burn you." Serena considered this and did not sell. Something in her wanted the ring as a monument, a map of what had been and what might no longer be. The ring became a motif in her life, an object that people assumed to find her, but she guarded it like an archaeological find. She kept it because it marked a place on a map she was not yet ready to redraw. Hudson remained at the edges, then gradually closer. He attended press conferences because he could afford to be invisible in a room that wanted calma. He met with Serena and sat in the same small cafe where they went to be ordinary together. Two people doing astonishingly simple things like ordering croissants and setting down coffee in front of cups. He listened in a way that had the gravity of someone who understood that being heard is a rudimentary form of salvation.
They did not speak of love at first. They spoke of evidence, of lawyers, of how you reassembled a life that had been made into a spectacle. He offered practicalities. She accepted them because practicalities are instruments of control. Gradually, the small shared strategies accumulated into something like trust. On a bright, cold morning, they went to look at footage from the workshop that had captured the van. The salvation of small technicalities, timestamp, frame by frame, was a kind of courtship. They sat side by side in a department of police where fluorescent lights hummed and watched an image that gave them pieces of the truth. The camera showed boot prints, a gloved hand. It recorded faces more clearly than rumor. It suggested direction. Hudson pressed his hand into her back once, a quiet anchor in a room that smelled of disinfectant and official paper. "We'll find them," he said. He did not promise miracles. He promised industry. That promise was enough. But for every step forward, there was a shove backward. A legal deposition brought a reporter who asked the sort of questions designed to pry scars open. Had Serena ever consumed too much? Had she been known to act unpredictably? The boredom of ordinary cruelty fed on the sticky edges of scandal. One acquaintance, Grace, called with a soft voice that suggested she was the sad teller of bad news, and said, "There's more. People are saying things you can't control." She would not say who. The sentence was a serration of empathy. Serena began to realize that the currency of reputation was not just truth, but momentum. People took the path of least resistance and weighted their empathy accordingly. If she wanted to regain any semblance of control, she would have to make her own momentum. So she worked. She gave interviews in which she did not perform for pity but for clarity, the kind that made people decide where to place their bets. She sat with Drew and a therapist and listed edges of recovery like items on a checklist: phone therapy, sleep schedules, gradual exposure to crowds. She agreed to a fundraiser for a shelter for women, a thing that would have made her mother proud, because nothing steadied the world like giving it a corner of itself that did good. And then, on a Tuesday, a small mundane miracle happened. Surveillance footage from a deli half a mile from where she had been taken showed one of the van's men buying time with a newspaper. The footage put his face in a lineup. It suggested a mistake, an overlooked human tick that unraveled a knot. The police used it. They made an arrest. The legal machine turned and a name became attached to behavior. The victory was public in a way that mattered. It was not sweeping, it was a hinge. For the first time since the chandelier and the ring, Serena felt the air around her loosen its grip. She began to plan, not with the fantasy of revenge, but with the steady logistics of a person reassembling a life.
She reached out to the editors who had delayed the spread and asked for a fair accounting. She spoke at the shelter, quietly and with a voice that steadied. People left messages that were no longer pitiful but admiring. Through all of it, Asher hovered like a half-remembered threat. He said the right things in the wrong order, sometimes apologizing in the language of convenience. "I regret my actions. I was thoughtless. I miss you." He said things that revealed himself, a man accustomed to getting what he wanted because people made allowances for him. He had been untouched by consequence long enough to believe he could write his way back into her life. Serena did not respond to his offers. She filed messages into folders and then into the trash. She refused the invitation she sent under the guise of reconciliation. She had learned that choosing him was not a single night's decision, but a long-laced pattern. If she was going to make a new life, she would have to do it with her eyes open. 2 weeks after the arrests, on a day that smelled like rain and possibility, she received an envelope. It contained a court deposition that showed communications between Luna and a man who, once analyzed, proved complicit in the abduction. The chain of messages read like a ledger of motive. Someone had the decency and the courage to put the threads into law. Serena held the papers like someone accepting a map. The evidence did not undo the humiliation, but it made the humiliation less total. It told the world there had been a plan. It named actors. Hudson sat with her that evening in a small downtown restaurant with the kind of low light that redistributed shadows. They spoke of the future in a way that was almost brusque, scheduling meetings, arranging statements, drafting op-eds. It was work. It was also the soft, steady business of two people doing the boring things that love later builds on. Shared calendars, practical support, a presence that moves towards crisis rather than away. "You could leave it," Hudson said, his fork paused in midair. "You could walk away from all of this." She considered it. The ring, the press, the whispered assurances of casual allies. Walking away had an appeal that felt like a reset. But who was she if not someone who did not finish her sentences? She had invested in being known. She would not uninvest merely because it was painful. "I won't be erased," Serena said. He reached across the candle and placed his hand over hers. It was not a takeover but an offering. "Then let's document everything," he said. "Let's make sure your story is the one with proof." The city moved forward in its seasons. The headlines shifted for a day and then another. But in quieter rooms, new threads were being sewn. Luna, who had once leveled pity like an instrument, began to feel the prickle of defensive calculation.
Rumors surfaced that she had been an instigator, that she had a history of working the edges of men's affections for personal advantage. A photograph leaked, showing her meeting with one of Ethan's associates, too casual for coincidence. It suggested motive, and therefore shadowed her. Asher noticed. He noticed the change like a man watching an investment switch portfolios. He was not fully removed from power. He had money, he had connections, but he felt suddenly like someone who had watched his options narrow. His father's displeasure was an undercurrent, a pressure that had begun to stain his days. The public, always fond of a redemption arc, had not yet forgiven him for the theatrics of the altar. People wanted endings, and he had not given them one. Serena watched the shifts from a new vantage, from within a life that had been complicated into work and therapy and small domesticities. She
She felt both the possibility of vindication and the fatigue of having to fight for the right to be recognized as a survivor rather than a spectacle. She kept evidence in a folder, consulted it night after night, and in those hours the future felt less like a cliff and more like something that could be engineered. Then, as if to remind her of the city's taste for surprise, there was a night in which she thought the worst had been behind her. She had been going to meet a contact who said he had heard new whispers about the chain of conspiracy. He suggested a warehouse on the river where men sold off old freight and old grudges. She went alone because the only way to test courage is to accept the risk of being unaccompanied and find you can still stand. It was a mistake to go alone. As she approached the warehouse, the echo of her heels was swallowed by a soundless air. There was a movement, a hiss that might have been the shiver of a curtain, and then the floor tilted into pitch. Someone had left a bike lying across the pavement, a sloppy trap. She twisted, felt a sharp presence at her ankle, and then the sting. The venom worked quick and stupid, the kind of small cruelty that leaves chemistry at the center of terror. She thought of the snake stories Auntie Chen had told, of the way some people think of jinxes as explanations. The bite was a black little punctuation on the inside of her thigh. She knew, in the instinct of someone who has been to hospitals, that it could be small or it could bloom into something monstrous. She tried to stand and found the room uncooperative. Her vision haloed into luminous circles. She reached for her phone, but the battery died, as if the world itself had chosen to go dark. She crawled toward the light of a street lamp, and then another face blocked it. She saw boots, and then a hand tethered her with a cloth suddenly tight at the mouth. The last clear thing she saw was the van door opening, and a figure inside who recognized her. For a stunned second she thought it might be Asher coming to his senses. It wasn't.
It was Ethan's silhouette leaned in, and as the van closed and the world narrowed to the thud of a heart and the sting in her leg, she realized how precarious the bridge between survival and defeat could be. Somewhere far away, as the van sped into the city's indifferent night, the headlights fell over a familiar profile, Hudson, crossing the street in a raincoat, coffee forgotten in his hand. He had been nearby for work. He had made a last-minute decision to walk instead of taking the elevator. He paused at the corner, and his eyes picked up the sight of the van. He frowned in a way that moved from confusion to a concentrated concern he did not allow himself to wear lightly. He checked the time on his phone and saw a notification, an article about the previous arrests, and a link to a camera feed that might have missed a detail. He decided to follow the van. Back in the vehicle, Serena's pulse hammered against the edges of consciousness. The poison was doing what poison does, precise, indifferent. She fought to keep words in her head like small flags for rescue. Breathe, name, count. She thought of the ring in a drawer somewhere, of Auntie Chen's face, of Hudson's quiet hand on her shoulder. The van turned into an industrial maze and then slowed. A voice, Ethan's voice, said something that cut like a wire. "They'll have to trade for her," he said. "Asher will know what to do." Serena pressed her fingers into the upholstered seat until the world became a pattern under her palms. She could feel the weight of the night and the city and the people who had chosen sides in a fight she had not accepted in full. She did not have the energy to be angry. She had the clarity of someone whose body had narrowed to the imperative of staying conscious. On the sidewalk, Hudson read the van's license plate and moved, quick and efficient, calling a number he would later claim to have on speed dial for reasons he could not explain. He had a team, people who answered to him for reasons of loyalty and fear and pay, and they converged like a small army. He did not know, as he called, whom he would find. He only knew the van's pattern, and the city's geography had taught him how to predict flows. At the warehouse, lights flicked on in the same sequence as the van's engine cut. The men inside argued in low voices, pleased with their plan. They had calculated the leverage a woman in the spotlight could command, the way her presence might hasten a man's confession. Inside the van, Serena braced herself. Every breath felt like a negotiation between mind and material body. She repeated a name like an incantation. Hudson, Drew, Auntie Chen. She clung to the idea that someone would see the van's path and put the pieces together. She had to trust that the world would not fold in on her. Hudson's car stopped a block away. He did not run, he never run, but he walked into motion with a professional calm.
He dialed the police with a concise report, and then did what men in his position sometimes do. He leveraged resources. He used a friend at city surveillance, and he watched the feed on his phone that showed a van sliding toward a dock. He did not think heroic thoughts. He thought of tactical moves. The van parked. The door opened.
Hands reached out. Serena pushed one last time against the chemical fog. The city made a decision in that hour, whether to claim her or to toss her aside as another woman found and lost to its appetite for stories. She had, in the weeks before, thought the hardest thing would be to reclaim a reputation. She realized now the harder thing was to reclaim herself when someone had taken her as if she were a pawn. A light shone through the van's slat. A voice cried out from the street, someone who had seen the van loitering, who had remembered the earlier arrests and decided enough was enough. The men scrambled. Hudson appeared then, not with a cinematic crash, but with the competent force of someone who had a plan for these emergencies. The van's door slammed. Men fled. A scuffle gave way to the crackle of radio and the arrival of uniforms like punctuation. She passed out and went to the place that is neither darkness nor light, where the edges are fuzzy and voices become suggestions. Someone wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and hissed a name like a prayer. She heard Hudson say her name as if it were a vow. At dawn, she woke in a hospital with Drew at the foot of the bed, his face pressed with relief and exhaustion. The bite had been treated, the antivenom administered, her blood monitored. The toxins had been arrested before they could do irreversible damage, and there was a small clinical wonder in knowing that medicine, not myth, had saved her. "You were lucky," Drew said, not as consolation, but as fact. "You were very lucky." Outside the window, the city breathed its indifferent breath. News vans circled in the distance, but inside there was a private gravity. Hudson sat in a chair by the window, hands folded, watching the world he did not always inhabit but had chosen to enter on her behalf. He had called no cameras. He had asked. He had called no cameras. He had asked only that whatever needed fixing be fixed quietly. He sat in the chair by the window the way some men inhabit a room, like they own the map of it, but his presence was, at that hour, a kind of petition. Drew, exhausted and blunt, outlined a plan and clipped sentences: follow-up for the venom, a referral to a specialist for the lingering neural symptoms, a note that she should not travel alone for a while. The doctors used the language of small victories. The nurses offered practical kindness, an extra pillow, plastic cups so she could drink without effort. Hudson took the check for the bills without comment and left it unpaid in an envelope that read like an insurance against future chaos.
The press finally arrived at the periphery, their vans like late-arriving weather. Hudson met them with the economy of a man who understood the trade-off between silence and spectacle. He declined interviews, thanked people for their concern, and spoke only once, the way a judge reads a small ordinance. What matters now is her recovery. The line had weight because no one expected poetry from him. The absence of overreach made the sentence behave like a fact. Serena slept and woke in waves of exhaustion and clarity. She had the small recoveries that come after a night someone else filled with fear. A call from Auntie Chen that was more recipe than sermon. Drew's practical insistence that she attend therapy. Hudson's quiet logistics that translated into care without intrusion. She found herself watching the ring on her dresser in a new light. The gold no longer gleamed with promise. Instead, it caught the lamplight and showed a map of the scars she had collected. She left it there, not because it belonged to him anymore, but because it marked a place in the geography of what had happened. She would not throw away the terrain of a life simply because it had been bruised. The arrests that followed were not cinematic so much as administrative. Statements taken, court dates set, a detective who developed a taste for certain kinds of files the way others develop a taste for coffee. Ethan and 2 of his men went to court. Luna's photographed meeting with one of Ethan's associates shifted her from suspect to defendant in the court of rumor. Evidence attached itself like a heavier garment. Messages showed coordination, dates, locations, veiled payments. The chain of words read like ledger lines for a plan. Asher's role in the mess was less tidy. He had not organized the abduction. He had not signed off on a single transaction in ink. What the evidence told, however, was more damning in a quieter way. He had failed to act. He had allowed spaces to exist where people like Ethan found purchase. Texts between him and Luna showed a pattern of secrecy that bordered on complacency. Where there had been the presumption of private things, now there was a paper trail. It was not a courtroom thunderbolt that did him in. It was the way privilege had a protocol that, when disturbed, retracted its support. His father did not need to read a police report to know the damage. Mr. Lin, who had once smiled through awkward moments like a man who never wanted to escalate, began to show up in headlines as disappointed and withdrawn. His investments tightened. Guests declined invitations. A company that had once been in Asher's orbit quietly moved accounts. The public loves a narrative with an arc, and it had a small appetite for comeuppance.
Asher lost things that mattered to him in a particular order: status, then access, then the complacent assumption that people would make allowances for him.
The same nights he once spent with Luna in corners of the city where the music muffled the truth, he now spent in rooms lit by the cold glow of his phone, scrolling through headlines and replies that contained a single tenor: he had been the man who abandoned a woman on the most public of nights. The social world is a ledger, and an unpaid debt accrues interest. Hudson's role remained pragmatic. He never fashioned himself into a savior. He helped secure legal counsel. He called in favors to shield Serena from predatory coverage, and when the case against Ethan and his associates proved solid, he insisted on support for the victims. He was steady in a manner that refused to be performative. His gestures were insurance rather than spectacle. In the quieter weeks that followed, Serena began to reconstruct a life with meticulous intent. Recovery required patience, sleep hygiene, therapy sessions that stared down the thrum of panic in her hands, phone calls that she scheduled rather than answered on impulse. She took up small projects, volunteering at the shelter, working with a legal team to clarify the sequence of evidence, and decided to turn the narrative that had been weaponized into one that could help others. Her speeches were spare, precise. She did not ask for sympathy, she asked for accountability. The shelters welcomed her with the kind of gratitude that has no cynicism, and those small acts put a steady limb back into her life. There was a time jump that felt less like magic and more like engineering. Months stitched together by therapy and court dates, and the bureaucratic nastiness that follows public scandal made a new Serena, clearer, less willing to cede her life to whoever walked through and claimed a corner of it. The ring remained in that dresser, a fixture. She no longer wore it as a symbol of submission. She kept it as a record. She began to date the calendar like someone drafting a future to which she had title. Hudson was present in the margins that matter most, at a hearing where she needed a witness, in late-night texts where she admitted to frayed nerves or small triumphs, on one occasion bringing soup when illness made the world seem heavy. Their courtship was a ledger of practical kindness. It was not glamorous, not the stuff of the tabloids that had once turned their lives into serial headlines. It was the honest geometry of two people finding the same center. They ate meals that consisted of conversation and lists, investments in lawyers, in therapy, in a new PR strategy that refused to weaponize the past. They took walks in a park that kept its winter grass and warmed slowly to spring. Hudson listened without needing his own voice elevated. He drew a line in his life that made space for Serena's autonomy. He never offered to fix what she had to fix herself. Slowly, trust accumulated like small deposits. The wedding, when it came, wasn't an exclamation point so much as a decisive period.
It arrived not in a chandeliered hall, but at a small registry office, with a handful of witnesses who had seen the slow work of reclamation. Serena chose the guest list like someone who knew which hearts could be trusted in a storm. Auntie Chen was there, Drew was there. A few friends from the shelter came, and Hudson's colleagues attended with a tenderness that had the quality of restrained applause. The dress was spare. The ring that time was a new one, simple and unadorned. Serena's hands moved differently across the table as she signed the line that made them legally bound. She looked at Hudson and saw continuity. Not a savior, not a shield, but a partner. She had chosen to marry the CEO because she wanted the dignity of being selected by a man who knew how to be steady. But that explanation was too small. She married Hudson because marriage with him was an extension of the agency she had worked for. He respected that she would continue to lead a life of her own. He did not own her narrative. He joined it. After the marriage, there was a calibrated calm. The press made a small show of interest, how the CEO had married the once humiliated bride, but the story lacked the venom of before. People are impatient with sequels to scandals, and the city often tires of moral drama. Serena found, to her quiet surprise, that being married to Hudson did not make her immune to loneliness or sorrow. It merely moved the field of those experiences into a place where she could decide how to act. She still slept with the ring from the old engagement in a small ceramic dish beside her bed sometimes, a relic rather than a directive. And then Asher came back. He arrived with the sort of humility that had been absent the first time he stood before her. There was no triumphant swagger. He looked smaller, not simply because of the public erosion of privilege, but because the private architecture of his life had shifted beneath him. His father had distanced himself in ways a man with money can make more cruel than bankruptcy. Quiet reassignments, fewer invitations, the soft exiling that the social elite perform when they wish to nurse dignity without spectacle. His company had stalled on some projects. A court connection had revealed him to be someone who made avoidable choices. He had lost friends who had once packaged him as charming. The first time he appeared, it was at a small public event, an awards night where the city's charitable apparatus rotated through its annual rituals. He was in the room and he tried, clumsily, to intercept a conversation. Hudson received him with the blade of civility that men like Hudson wielded, courteous, unyielding, not an inch more than necessary. Asher watched Serena across the room like someone reading a script where he had once been the lead. When he finally spoke to her, it was not with the entitlement that had characterized his previous life. He said her name carefully, as if testing the sound of it.
He asked then to speak privately. There was a brief temptation, like the instinct to see whether a wound has scabbed over, to indulge a conversation. Serena agreed to a coffee, not in the old cafe where time was complicit, but in a neutral space that had no memory of vows. He sat down with both hands wrapped around a cup, a posture that betrayed both nervousness and a hope for absolution. The man who had once walked away with ease now asked for things simple and small, a chance to explain himself, to be forgiven, to be listened to. His voice was low. He did not read from a script, but he offered a different sort of confession, not one scripted for press releases, but one that felt like private collapse. "What I did was unforgivable," he said. It was a line that could have been theater, but there was rawness in his eyes. I left you publicly. I thought it was a choice I could make, but I realize now I abandoned responsibilities, not just to you, but to the truth." He spoke of shame, of late nights filled with regret, of friends who had been less reliable than he had imagined. He spoke of Luna with a complicated tenderness that borderlined on blame. She had been both an old flame and a person he had failed to keep boundaries with. He admitted small cruelties, delays, omissions, and then significant ones. He had witnessed communications that, in the soft way of a callous mind, he had not acted upon. He had realized, after the arrests and the consequences, that silence can be a kind of consent. There was an ache to his admission, but Serena had learned to parse ache from accountability. She asked questions that were not bait, but calibration. What did he intend to do differently? Would he testify? Would he accept responsibility to the people hurt? Could he stand accountable when the cameras left the room? He answered with promises and partial explanations. He said he had tried to call her after the abduction, that he had been scared, that he had felt impotent. He said he had been worried that any action would implicate him further. The excuses were not the point, she understood. The point was that he wanted something from her. He wanted to come back. The reading of his request made her laugh once, a short, incredulous sound that was more habit than humor. "You left me at the altar," she said. The sentence folded years into a small factuality. She had said it before, but re-speaking it made the history of the night heavy in the room. "I know," he said. "I know I can't take it back. I know I'm asking for something too much. But I'm asking, please, let me try. I'll do whatever it takes." She had, in the weeks after the abduction and in the months of recovery, rehearsed responses. Part of her had imagined a scene where she would be magnanimous, a cinematic moment of forgiveness that would absolve both of them. Another part of her wanted the brutal closure that would never let him repair the harm with sentiment. Now, faced with him and the imploring in his voice, she felt a different force. The voice of the woman who had learned that forgiveness without structural change is an invitation to repeat mistakes. She told him the truth. Forgiveness, she said, was not currency he could spend to reclaim a life. It was a work that required him to do things he had never been willing to do. She asked him to make amends where it mattered, public apology, participation in community work, testimony where needed. She demanded accountability. Speak the truth to those who had been hurt. Accept a role that acknowledged his failures, and, if that was possible, an honest period of rebuilding, not predicated on his convenience. He promised. He pleaded. He offered currency he did not have, contrition that felt rehearsed, plans that sounded like attempts at redemption. But there was something else behind his words. The price of his return would depend on whether he could prove consistency, not charm. Serena gave him a choice. "Do the work," she said, slow and deliberate, "and don't make me the prize of your rehabilitation." It was a decisive refusal, couched in a chance for accountability. She left the conversation with her dignity intact, and with a small mercy extended, not to him, but to the idea that people can change under pressure. He left, insistent and broken, and still not in possession of the knowledge of how to be fully present. Even after that, Asher's public plea changed tone. A social media post, short, regretful, earnest, appeared with a photograph of him in the studio of a radio show where he had offered an unvarnished apology. It was not the poignant plea of a lover's return. It was a document of someone trying to re-enter the moral economy he had once taken for granted. The comments were mixed. Some saw sincerity, others saw performative rhythm. The press sniffed at it and then looked elsewhere. There was, however, a moment that forced a confrontation beyond apologies. At a gala months later, the city's philanthropic circuit convened, and the press was in attendance. Serena, now married to Hudson, arrived in a silver dress that had no echo of bridal white. It was an evening dedicated to the shelter work she had championed, a cause that had come to be associated with her by dint of labor rather than gossip. Asher appeared that night as well, not because he had been invited by her, but because the charity was one of the larger ones in the city's orbit, and in the new economy he was trying to re-enter, appearance had currency. He found her in a crowded hallway, the soft roar of conversations like a tide. He approached with a timidity that made his approach almost humble. The old impulse would have been for him to seize the night, to interrupt and make it about him. Instead, he asked quietly if he could say a word. She allowed it, and he spoke in front of a gathering that included some of the women from the shelter she had championed.
His apology this time had more substance. He acknowledged the specific harms he had allowed to happen. He named neglect, he named cowardice. And this was the important part. He named the people he had wronged not as accessories to his story, but as the owners of their own suffering. He spoke of his silence about Luna's meetings with Ethan's associate. He admitted he had been cowardly about protecting someone he had pledged to protect. The room breathed. Some women nodded. Others looked away. Hudson, standing a few paces behind Serena, watched with an expression that was complicated. He was not the jealous husband in the shorthand of tabloids. He was a man watching someone he trusted navigate a public demonstration of accountability. After his statement, Asher did something unexpected. He walked up to one of the shelter's founders, an older woman, and asked how he could be of service. He signed up for a shift, not a headline-laden donation, but a schedule block of time to work at intake. It was small and unglamorous. It was, Serena thought, the sort of apprenticeship and character she had once only dreamed of forcing on him. In the months that followed, Asher's path to redemption, if one must name it that, was slow and halting. There were stumbles. He made statements that needed correction. He missed opportunities to do the right thing and then tried to repair them with effort. He learned, painfully, that the mechanics of making amends are not theatrical but logistical. Ethan went to prison after a judge accepted a plea that included testimony from men who had been offered immunity in exchange for naming co-conspirators. Luna, implicated by both photographic evidence and depositions, was charged and eventually pleaded guilty to conspiracy. The court hearings were messy, public in the way all legal resolutions are when they cross the social life of the city. The prosecutors did not romanticize Serena's suffering. They presented evidence, messages, bank transfers, meetings. The legal machinery moved in its slow, scrupulous way, and for the first time in months, truth gained a credential that rumors lacked. Serena watched the proceedings from a reserved seat in a small gallery, the ring from the old engagement burning its absence like a memory. She did not clutch at vengeance. Instead, she took notes, she supported witnesses, and she ensured that anyone who had been affected had the legal and emotional support needed. She saw in the process the complicated architecture of justice, not a catharsis, but a hard, necessary sorting. There was a day, after the cases wound toward resolution, when Asher came to her door. He had tears in his eyes that were not quite polished for the cameras. He had the air of a man who had been stripped of illusions and was asking for something that had changed shape for both of them. "I'm asking you to see me differently," he said. He meant it to be a plea that could be met with reconciliation.
He wanted, in the way desperate men often want, to be made whole by someone who had the power to forgive. She listened. She had, by then, become someone who could weigh motives with clearer instruments. She could see what he had lost: networking opportunities, invitations, the silent confidence of being unexamined. But she could also see what he had not done. He had not once, in the years before the altar, refused to be enchanted by his own convenience. "You left me," she said simply. "You left a public mark on my life. You left me to be the story, to be the object of pity and ridicule. You let the people who hurt me shape the narrative." He hung his head. "I know," he said, "and I can't undo it, but I can ask to be a person beside you, if you let me learn. Not get back together, not take what I want, learn." "You mean learn from me?" she asked, almost surprised.
Or learn for yourself so you can be less of the man who walked away? He flinched at that distinction, but it was the precise one that mattered. For myself, he said, for anything that comes after. There was a long silence in the doorway. The city outside carried on like a living thing, unconcerned with the hinges of individual lives. Inside, Serena measured the space she had earned. She had the authority now to set parameters, to accept his attempted change, to supervise it, to decide whether it would be transactional or transformational. She said she would allow him to be in the periphery of her life if he did 3 things: testify honestly in any pending matters, volunteer at the shelter with consistent hours, and issue public acknowledgement that laid out the wrongs in a way that refused the comfort of euphemism. She did not promise forgiveness. She promised a structure by which he could attempt to become a different man. Asher accepted, clumsily but with an earnestness that belonged to someone who had been stripped by consequence. He began the work. It was an apprenticeship in humility. There were setbacks, the temptation to charm his way into forgiveness, the old impulses to avoid discomfort. But there were also real steps: a letter to the shelter's board, months of unpaid volunteer work, and most significantly, public acknowledgments that named names and actions with flinching. The moment that shifted the arc for him publicly was not a plea, but a small, earnest act in a room with people who had been hurt. He stood in a circle of women and read aloud the ways he had failed, and then he listened as they told him the consequences of his choices: nights of fear, social anxieties, the work of therapy. He did not speak for minutes after. Listening in that moment was the harder labor. For Serena, watching him do the labor was not a balm, it was a demonstration. She could, if she were so inclined, offer a public statement of forgiveness. She could reclaim the story of a woman magnanimous in the face of injury.
But she had been transformed by the months of work, and she understood that forgiveness does not exempt someone from the moral cost of their actions. She would not re-enter an old pattern that cost her peace. When he came back to her, months later, it was as a different man, a lesser man in the sense of being less arrogant, and perhaps a more honest one. He asked for nothing more than the space to continue change, and a small truce that the city would not require of him impossible gestures. He did not ask to be restored to what he had lost. He asked instead for permission to be part of a community he had once abandoned. Serena granted him what she could: a place at the table of her life where work and accountability took precedence over romance. She refused to allow the old ring to dictate new behavior. She had, in marrying Hudson, claimed a new partnership that respected her autonomy. Her marriage was not a prison of wealth, nor a shield against regret. It was, instead, an alliance of equals. Hudson understood that his role was not to be a sentinel that boxed the world off from pain, but to stand with her and allow her agency to lead. The public watched the arc and drew its own conclusions. Some believed in Asher's recovery, others held a cautious skepticism. Gossip is a patient beast. But the important work was quieter: survivors finding community, men willing to be educated by consequences, institutions that could enforce accountability. Serena continued to work at the shelter, and sometimes she spoke at conferences where women told their own stories, not as spectacle, but as testimony to the work of rebuilding. There was one final gesture from Asher that mattered less in headline than in consequence. He agreed to fund a small grant for the shelter in the name of women whose names had been used as currency in scandals. It was not a headline-making donation, but a sustained commitment. The agreement included a clause for independent oversight, an acknowledgement that donors could no longer expect to write their own terms. He signed it in a room that smelled of coffee and paper, and when he left, he did not seek a photograph. He understood by then that the redeeming act is often the one that refuses applause. Serena watched him go with a tenderness that was not pity. It was the reserved affection of someone who had loved a version of a person and who had learned to love a self-same person only if that person accepted the work of change. She thought of the nights alone after the engagement party, and the night in the van, and the hospital's fluorescent dictatorship. She allowed herself to feel an odd, unromantic relief. She had survived. The jinx Auntie Chen had once whispered about, the small superstition that had once felt like an accusation, had, in time, been transformed into a metaphor.
Serena no longer spoke of curses. She spoke of choices.
The idea that she had been cursed was childish. The truth was more human and therefore truer. People choose, and those choices ripple outward. She had learned to see the jinx for what it was, a shorthand for the ways our decisions define us. The final scene came quietly. It was a small gala the shelter hosted for donors and volunteers. Serena stood at the head of the room, her speech written in the same careful hand as the speech she might have written on that previous fateful evening years ago. But the diction had changed. It was less about what she had endured and more about what the work of community could accomplish. She spoke of courage, of the slow arithmetic of healing, and of the civic necessity of accountability. She did not name Asher or Luna directly. She named actions and consequences. She referenced the ring only once. "I kept an object as evidence of what once was," she said, and the line was a small laugh in the room, not a wound. After the speech, people came to talk. Men and women who had once seen her with different eyes now saw an architect of change. Drew sat in the back with a glass of water, and Auntie Chen stood at the door, proud and small and steady. Hudson arrived to a small round of applause and waited for her with the practiced calm that had been his hallmark. Asher came to the event too. He did not approach immediately. He watched from the edge like someone respecting a boundary. When he finally did, he said only, "You were right to refuse what would have cost you peace." Serena smiled, a private, wry thing. "You learned some hard things," she said. "I'm glad you're trying." He nodded. "Thank you for allowing me this margin." She shrugged with the casualness of someone who had learned to live in the map she had drawn. The ring in her drawer caught the light that night as she moved through the crowd. She left it there when she went home, but it no longer seemed to define the edges of her life. Back at the apartment she and Hudson shared, she took out the old engagement ring one final time. It sat in her palm like a fossil, an object that proved a thing had happened. She did not put it back on. Instead, she folded it into a small box and placed it on a shelf with other artifacts, a pair of tickets to a bookstore reading she had once loved, a photograph of Drew and her joking at a cafe, a postcard from Auntie Chen with a recipe on the back. The box was a history. It was not a demand. Hudson watched her do it and then took her hand. "Are you all right?" he asked. She leaned back and let out a breath that had the shape of a laugh and a tear. "I am," she said. "Not whole in the way the tabloids like to measure it, but whole enough." He kissed the knuckle of her hand, an old, respectful gesture. "Then that's our business." The final image, the one that would run in the minds of those who had watched the unraveling and the rebuilding, was not of a woman in a white dress or of a man on his knees begging. It was of Serena standing at a window in the apartment she had chosen, looking out at a city that had once devoured her story and now offered it a quieter place. She had a life that was not shaped by what had been taken from her, but by what she had chosen to make. She kept the new ring on her finger, not as a talisman, but as a contract with herself, to live deliberately, to trust her judgment, and to demand a world where the dignity of people, particularly women, was not collateral in the stories of men. Asher continued his work, messy, imperfect, slow. Ethan served his sentence. Luna's name faded into the background of a life that, for her and for others involved, would never be simple again. Serena's name, once weaponized, became a shorthand for resilience that she neither wanted nor expected. She used it anyway, because sometimes names become tools you can wield. There was one night, years later, when Serena stood in the same park where she and Hudson had first walked after the rescue. They had children now, small, intermittent troublemakers who required schedules and patience. She watched them chase pigeons with an indulgence she had not known earlier in life. A man walked by with a woman on his arm. He smiled in a way that suggested he had never done anything to be ashamed of. Serena did not need to speak into his life. The city folded them into its pattern. She had learned the practical courage of living forward. She had chosen a life that was not about the altar left behind, but about the hands she now held. When someone years later asked her how she had come through, what had transformed the humiliation into this steadiness, she would say two truths: that she had learned to demand accountability of others and tenderness of herself, and that she had chosen a partner who respected that the work of rebuilding belonged to her first. The jinx, Auntie Chen would tell a friend in a voice that had softened with time, was nothing more than a superstition turned useful,
a reminder that the world works by decisions, not curses. Serena had decided, again and again, not to be owned by the past. That, more than anything else, had become her victory. If you want to see more stories where women reclaim their narratives and build lives on their own terms, subscribe for the next episode. There's always more to say about what people do after they survive.